Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May the peace and blessings of mercy of God be upon all of you. I'd like to start by expressing my gratitude at being invited to this event, the Father Victor Courtois Memorial Lecture at St. Xavier's University. And although the format I'm currently adopting, that of video, was not the ideal and is not the ideal format I would have otherwise wanted, I was very much looking forward to meeting all of you and speaking in person. I do hope that it goes some way towards assuaging to the wonders of modern technology the potential gap that my physical absence gives to the event. I was deeply honored when I first received the letter, and I do hope that there will be opportunities in the future whereby we can meet in person and we'll get a chance to interact, and hopefully I'll get a chance to learn from all of you. So I'd like to start my talk by extending my greetings first and foremost to all of the dignitaries at this event, the various dignitaries at St. Xavier's University, starting off with Reverend Dr. Father John Felix, Father Victor Edwin, the Honourable Chief Minister, the Honourable Mayor, and all of you who may have come from Kolkata or other parts of India and beyond. The topic I've been tasked to speak about is a topic of perennial importance to all of us. The question of who we are and where we derive our identity from is a question that has been asked since the beginning of time, since the first man. And how we often answer that question directly translates to our interaction with this world. And it's particularly relevant at a time when, in a world that feels itself beset by various forms of crisis, there is a riding wave of populism that generally tends to answer this question in very ethnocentric terms. I am a part of a specific group of people or nation or a tribe, and everyone outside that is an other that then has to be excommunicated or demonized or ridiculed. And unfortunately, this often gives into the very worst part of ourselves. The question of who am I is a far deeper question than what our personal preferences or prejudices, in fact, might wish to answer. It's a question that goes back to the very sense of our beingness. If, as I look out from my eyes, everything I see in this world is coming and going, if, as I go into my inner world of thoughts and experiences, that too is coming and going, if this body which I've readily identified myself with from as long as I can remember is constantly changing in a state of flux, then who is that I that is observing all of this? Who or what is that I or that field in which this transiency is coming to existence? Who is this subject that I take myself to be? This is a question that has been answered in various ways, as I said. And in the paper that I've given to you, I alluded first and foremost to a very dominant form in which that question has been answered, and it's a format that originated in Western Europe from about the 16th century, a format that created a separation, namely the Cartesian dualism of the mind and the body, whereby, as René Descartes famously said, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. So the I am was relegated to the mind, an interior dimension, and everything outside was seen as the body, which extended to the universe at large. Following on from Descartes and various other influential scientific figures who all believed in God, but in keeping with the current of thought of that time, relegated God to the role of a watchmaker, whereby God created the universe as a discrete one-off act, but somehow had set into place laws whereby the universe was functioning in and of itself. The analogy often given is the clockwork universe. This set into play a motion, literally a motion, whereby if man could become the controller or understander of these laws, then God would no longer be needed. And in fact, as the scientific method further developed, at a metaphysical level, although this is rarely admitted, but at a metaphysical level, there was no role for God. God or spirit, the animation or that which animates matter, was the one thing that could not be tested through the scientific method. And matter itself was given an inert nature. Matter is just matter. And so what was primary was the qualities of matter, and what was secondary was that which could not be measured. Now this dominant way of looking at the world as a machine, which Frithjof Capra calls the Newtonian world machine, came to dominate much of science. And in the realm of conscious studies, and this is why I alluded to this in this paper, it has led to the defining of the I, our sense of our existence, as being, according to many people, an epiphenomenon. The very sense that I exist is just a mental byproduct of the mechanistic processes of the dead and inert matter that make up who I really am. Now, obviously, this is not uniformly accepted as consensus in the scientific community, and often scientists who go to a deeper level, at the quantum level, do actually dispute the division between the observer and the observed. And many a person, Frithjof Capra, who I quoted, was one, including someone else known as Peter Russell, have started commenting that the very issue of looking ourselves or looking at ourselves as a separate I precludes us from being able to answer effectively the question of who or what our consciousness is. And instead they posit that the world consists of a field of knowing, whereby everything that we consider to be matter is coming into existence in this field of consciousness, and this field of consciousness is looking at itself. In doing so, they've posited what is actually in many ways the mystic or religious and spiritual answer to that question. Most of you, I understand, will be from Christian backgrounds, and so you may appreciate the understanding of the ever unfolding Logos, whereby God is allowing himself to be known in the world. Of course, some of you may be from a Hindu background, and so you will appreciate the concept of the Leela, the divine play, whereby Maya, this apparent delusion of separation, is juxtaposed with the knowledge that is to be gained of Brahma, the one God who is revealing himself through all of this. And this understanding permeates Islam as well. And in many ways it probably does, because Islam doesn't claim to itself to be a historical religion that arose through the historical person of the Prophet Muhammad. Rather, Islam's own faith claim is that it is the same path from the beginning of time, from the beginning of Adam. And it's the essence of the message of calling people to Tawheed, calling people to witness the one. The word Tawheed actually means making one in the presence of more than one. The ability to see one when there appears to be more. And not only to see that one, but to come to worship that one and serve that one by mirroring that one in this world. And this is what, in essence, is what the Muslims call the Shahada, the testimony of faith. And so now the question of why was anything created is answered in Islam in very much the way I've alluded to of these other spiritual traditions. There's a famous tradition that is authentic in meaning, ascribed to the Prophet, in which he speaks about how God refers to himself as kanzan makfiyan, a hidden treasure. And the tradition goes on to say, فَأَحْبَبْتُ, and I loved to be known. So I created creation in order that I be known. In other words, God in his pure undifferentiatedness, when there was nothing else. In another tradition, the Prophet says, كَانَ اللَّهُ وَلَا شَيْءَ مَعَهُ, God was and there was nothing else besides. In this state of undifferentiatedness, there was no one to know God, and God wanted to be known. But his wanting to be known didn't arise out of a dire need. No, it arrives, as the tradition says, فَأَحْبَبْتُ, out of hope, out of love. He wanted to be known out of love. And in that wanting to be known out of love, he creates creation. But does creation stand separate to his creative act? Is his creative act a one-off in the nature of that watchmaker analogy? Can anything sustain and create itself? No. The Islamic answer is that being itself is enwrapped and entwined with his creative fiat, his creative command. Kun fayakun, be and it is. Nothing else can be put into creation except that God is the one sustaining and nurturing it. As the Quran says, Wallahu khalaqakum wa ma ta'malun. God creates you and that which you do. Another verse it says, and show me anything else that can be created other than by God. And so in this creation, God is letting himself be known by revealing himself in creation. In fact, the Quran says that at the point God brings into creation, he specifically says that وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسِ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. I didn't create mankind and jinn. And these are two forms of parallel creation that God has singled out for يَعْبُدُونَ, for a specific type of worship, يَعْبُدُونَ. And the most authentic commentaries say that the reality of that يَعْبُدُونَ is يَعْرِفُونَ, to be the ones who know. Because you can truly only worship that which you truly only know. And so in this knowing and in God wanting himself to be known, he brought specifically man as the vehicle, or more pertinently, the soul of man by which that knowing happens. Now, how can the soul of man be so crucial to this process by which God is letting himself be known? For here we go to the Quranic story about the creation of Adam. The Quran says that when Adam was created, the angels who were gathered around said, are you going to create someone who will sow mischief and corruption in this world? It's as if the angels could foretell the many tragedies, the many violations that man will commit, first and foremost against himself. And God's response was, I know that which you do not know. And the Quran goes on to say, he taught man all of the names, or he taught Adam all of the names. And at that point, the angels bow down in prostration to man out of reverence to God. So what was it that gave man, and the Quran literally says, we make him a Khalifa, we will make Adam a vicegerent, or the one who represents God on earth. What was it that makes him give that ability to represent God on earth? It is specifically those names that he was taught. So what are those names? Those names are the substantiation of those manifestations of God that will occur on earth. You see, if the primary reason for God creating was for himself to be known, then what is it he wants to be known? He wants himself to be known in the various manifestations of himself. The various manifestations of which can be divided into two broad themes, because it's through opposites that things are known. One of those themes is a strong theme, a theme of majesty and justice. And another of those themes is a soft theme, a theme of mercy and love. In Arabic, we call them the names of God that are Jalali names, the harder names, and the names of God that are the Jamali names, the softer names. And this combination, usually Muslims say 99 names, but they are innumerable names because all of these names go back to attributes of God. And so when we say 99, usually Muslims are trying to say these are the usuli, the core manifestations of God. But all of these names that denote how God wants to be known will be revealed and were already imprinted on the soul of Adam. And the fact that they were imprinted on the soul of Adam meant that Adam had come to know all of that God wanted to be known already. And so the Quran says that with that being imprinted on his soul, the angels bowed down. Now, the Quran also goes to say that then all of the descendants of Adam, all of us as human beings, were taken from Adam and arranged as a collection of souls in front of God. And God at that moment said, Alastu bi rabbikum? Am I not your Lord? And that question, am I not your Lord? The word used was Rabb. And Rabb is a very powerful word because the word Rabb is directly connected to the sense of worship. In Arabic, the word Rabb means the one who's constantly raising you from state to state, from station to station, and to a position of completion. And what that meant was God was saying, am I not the one who is going to teach you all of your names? Am I not the one who's taught you all of these names? And the souls responded by saying, قَالُوا بَلَا شَهِدْنَا. Yes, we've seen it. And then the Quran goes on to say, and this so that no one can say, I was of this ignorant. In other words, all of us have already within us, in our souls, this knowledge of who God is. And this is why Muslims believe that every child, as the Prophet said, كُلُّ مَوْلُودٍ يُولَدْ عَلَى الْفِطْرَةِ, every child is born upon this natural inclination, this natural disposition, already knowing his Lord, and coming into this world seeing that oneness. But the nature of childhood and the nature of this world is that we're pulled out of that oneness. We're pulled out of that tawheed. And as we're pulled out of that tawheed, the objects of this world call us. And the worst of those things that can happen is as they call us, we get pulled out of our own sense of being part and parcel of that oneness, part and parcel of being governed and manifested by God. And we say, as the Quran says, which is the primal transgression, if the primal disposition is seeing this oneness of God, then the primal transgression, the Quran says, كَلَّا إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَيَطْغَى أَن رَآهُ اسْتَغْنَى. Man goes beyond the boundaries of his own humanity when he begins to see himself as independent. He begins to see himself as an I that is independent of God. Begins to see him as an I that is separate to the manifestations of the universe. Begins himself to see himself as an individuated I, and this is the egoic I. And as one of the spiritual scholars have said, رَأْسُ كُلُّ خَطِيَّةٍ رُؤْيَةَ النَّفْسِ وَأَفْعَالِهَا, that the root source of every evil and misfortune in this world is the seeing of ourselves as an I and the actions that proceed thereby. And so this way of functioning often takes over. And so what happens is that when a person gradually acquires his own faculties and goes from childhood to adulthood, then he has what's known as taklif, a responsibility, to return back to that state of witnessing and to return back to that state of knowing. And this is why Islam says that every single nation was sent a messenger, telling them and reminding them of this shahada. The word shahada literally means witnessing. And telling them that what? The first part of the shahada is always know that God is one, a unique one, a oneness without a second, and to see the essential emptiness of all form as being a manifestation of that one. As the Quran says, Kul hu Allahu ahad, say God is that uniquely one. Allahu samad, and God is the one who is samad. The word samad literally means that which has no emptiness, because the opposite of samad is when someone has a jawf. So the word samad means man la jawfa laha, that which has no emptiness, which means everything other than samad is empty. Which means if you look into yourself as an individuated person, you'll eventually arrive at a point when you can't find yourself. You're empty. As the Quran says, كُلُّ شَيْءٍ هَالِكٍ إِلَّا وَجْهَهُ, every single thing is continually perishing except his face. And when you find your emptiness, what you'll see is that emptiness is not empty at all. Just beyond that emptiness is the manifestness of the one who's bringing you about. And that's why the Quran also says, فَأَيْنَمَا تَوَلُّوا, wheresoever you turn, فَثَمَّ وَجْهُ اللَّهِ, there is the face of God. There is the face of God to your left, to your right, above and below. And there's a face of God if you look in. Because God is the one who's manifesting himself through everything. And so this shahada was to remind people of this oneness of God. And that's why Muslims don't believe that Islam came through the Prophet Muhammad as a historical Islam, or the Quran was the manifestation of Islam. Muslims believe that Islam started with the first man, Adam. And every single nation had a Islam. right? Not necessarily entailing it was in Arabic, not necessarily entailing they were speaking the Arabic phrases that we come to associate with Islam today, but they were resonant at the level of that meaning of that oneness. And as part of that oneness, there was a way of manifesting the service. So once the Shahada was recognized, then they'd have to enact it. And that's why I, as a Muslim, might come across as strange to some of you, but I can wholeheartedly believe in my heart, and in fact that is my own opinion, that Gautam Buddha was most likely a Muslim, because when I see the Four Noble Truths, I can see in them, in meaning, is the resonance of the Shahada, the first Shahada of Islam, and the fourth Noble Truth, which is the Eightfold Noble Path, is just the way to serve. I can see Adi Shankara, the major Hindu figure who is often associated with the Advaita, which literally is Tawheed, not two, understanding God, the oneness of God, but not being two. I can see him as either being a prophet of Islam or being a follower or a great understander of Islam. Of course, these are people who Muslims can't take a definitive position upon theologically because they're not referenced, but at least in a direct, indisputable format in their texts. But Muslims can readily say Jesus was a prophet of Islam, Abraham was a prophet of Islam, Isaac, Noah, Jacob, many of the people who otherwise are not associated. Why? Because their essence of their message was always calling people to that oneness and how to serve in that oneness. The only distinction that Muslims would say is that the Prophet Muhammad is the last of those chain of messengers, and his revelation accordingly was preserved. And that revelation consisted of the revelation of the book that he was given, the Quran, and secondly, his person, which was the explanatory way of explaining the Quran. As his wife said, كَانَ خُلُقُهُ الْقُرْآنِ, his character itself was the best way of explaining the Quran. And so Adam has been given this format of knowledge, and all of us have been given this format of knowledge in our souls of knowing God. But we need to be reminded, and this is why the messengers have come, and this is why there's a way of understanding. And the way of understanding is then now a way of reformation. Because once we come to understand what it means, then we need to realize that we need to work on ourselves, to return ourselves back to that primordiality of witnessing God. And the Quran posits the first stage of that recognition as rising ourselves away from the base level. Base level for most of humanity is nafsun ammaratun bisu, the self that commands to evil, because it's rooted in this egoic identity of me. And many people do not think there is anything other than me and myself as an egoic person. And that is the one, that ego is that which commands to evil, because it only premises its operation on its own selfish interest. And that's why the Quran often corroborates or gives analogy as such a person as the one who worships his own desires. Or in another verse it says, the person like this is as an example of the panting of a dog. It's not belittling dogs. Dogs are fine, but it's using the analogy of the panting of a dog. In other words, that insatiable appetite, because it says in tatruku, if you leave it, the dog still pants, and if you give it food, it still pants. This resonates with other traditions where they have this imagery of the hungry ghost, the person who's never really satiated, and this is the nature of that base level, unreformed egoic level, and this is called nafsan amaratun bisu. But if a person wishes to reform himself, then he goes to the second level, which is the beginning of the spiritual path, which is the nafs al-lawama. The Quran has a verse in which God swears, he takes an oath, وَلَا أُقْسِمُ بِنَفْسِ اللَّوَّامَةِ, I swear by the self that blames itself. And in the Islamic understanding, God only takes an oath by that which is beloved to him. And so the point at which a person gains some self-knowledge and begins the process of self-reflection, even if he's still mired and in a state of difficulty, is a state of that being beloved to God. It's the first step on the way of repentance, and it's the first stage on the way of Tawbah. The Arabic word for repentance is Tawbah, which literally means to realign yourself, to return yourself back to God. And when a person makes that step, then he starts blaming himself. Lawama means to blame that tendency which supports and justifies the ego. And that's why the Quran says, Balil insan ala nafsihi basira. If a person really wishes, he can look at himself through his insight and he can see the ways in which he's misguiding himself. وَلَوْ أَلْقَى مَعَاذِيرًا, even if he's putting forward excuses. And if a person continues in this state, then the Quran says that a person reaches a state which is the third stage of reformation, known as the nafs al-mulhama, the self that wishes to be inspired or is inspired by God. Because through his reformation and through his constant blaming and his ability to take himself to task, he changes his habits and he takes out that which was bad from his life and brings it that which is good. Then the Quran refers to this as a way of bringing light to our hearts. And if we bring light to our hearts, we're only casting light on who we really are. The Prophet gave an analogy of sin as being something that leaves a black dot on the heart. And what that meant is that it occludes us from that part of the heart which already knows who we are and knows who God is. If you remember how I said, having seen the oneness of God, all of our hearts have muntabi'atun, that imprint already on it of that oneness of God. But when we act from a position of separation, when we sin, and the essence of sin is that separation, then we alienate ourselves from ourselves. But if we take the path of reformation, then we bring ourselves closer and closer to ourselves. And so the third stage becomes nafs al-mulhama, as the Quran says, فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا, that God begins to send inspiration to such a person as to what is the benefit, what is in benefit to that soul, and what is in corruption to that soul. And of course, at this stage, most Muslim scholars would say that there becomes the need for a mentor. Because the more you become opened up to the spiritual world, the more you also become opened up to the demonic world, because in every level there are opposites, and so the angelic world consists alongside the demonic world, and so there needs to be a way of deciphering this. And it is possible that people could be deluded. It is possible that people could think God's speaking to me, whereas someone else is speaking to you. And so at that point, a person needs a mentor, someone who's more completed on that path. But if a person is grounded in his inspiration and doesn't slip and doesn't fall back into his ego and think I'm the one who's being inspired, as opposed to seeing and this abetting and aiding his slavehood and his constant allowing himself to be molded in the process of kenosis, undoing his ego for the sake of God, then a person rises from nafs al-mulhama to what the Quran says, Ya ayyuhatun nafs al-mutma'inna, O you self who is content. A person enters into a state of contentment. He finds his life becomes more content. Because a lot of ta'ab, a lot of anxiety, a lot of fatigue, if you follow your depressive thoughts, if you follow your anxious thoughts, if you follow whenever you're perturbed, it usually goes back to some type of control that you want to do with your me. Something that you think that will give you something, or something that you think they'll lose. It's a grasping, either an avidness to gain something or a fear to lose something. And the one who God takes into and he finds his succor and his nourishment through God, he arrives at a state of contentment, because that can never be taken away from him. Right? And that's why one of the verses say that the awliya of Allah, those who find their strength and their support through God because they've rested in the presence of God, لا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون. They have no fears, no imaginary fears of anything that be taken away from them. ولا هم يحزنون. And they don't delude themselves about some pasts. They're always ibn waqt. They're always in the moment that they're in. And so we've gone from the first base soul that incites to anger and selfishness, to the second soul which learns to self-reflectiveness and looks at itself. Then the third soul that now has moved on and has started becoming inspired, to the fourth soul, the nafs al-mutma'inna, that finds contentment. Now when it finds contentment, it shouldn't stop, because this could be a delusion. A person finds contentment and contents himself with his feeling of contentment. The Quran is saying there is more than that, because now your journey begins in God. Your journey begins to arrive at the presences of this unfathomable depth of what God is revealing himself to be. And if a person continues, then he becomes radiyan. He goes from the contentment to being pleased with God, because he begins to see more and more of these names of God that are being manifest in this world. A literate person is not a person who looks at a book and looks at the ink on the paper and says, what a nice curvature. A literate person who's being able to look at the ink on a book and to move beyond that ink into the mind and presence of the author. And this is the nature of someone who's looking at this world, wherein he's with the author of this world and not with its empty form. And this is the one who is radiyan, who's now with God. These are people who, when they look at you and me, the presence that comes to them first is the presence of the divine. And it's only behind that there will be the presence of anything else, because his only real manifestation is the divine. So they become radi'an. But then, if a person continues in that, then the Quran says he becomes mardiyan. So instead of being him just being pleased with God, he becomes pleasing to God. And if you look at the word radi and mardiyan, this is a mirror relationship. In other words, his soul becomes complete as a mirror. It becomes complete as a mirror. And what do we mean by becoming complete as a mirror? When we alluded to right at the beginning that God created this world to be known and for his names to be manifest in this world, then that which onlooks and that through which God sees this world and sees himself is that human soul that's been purified for him. And then the Quran then goes on to say, and this is the seventh soul after that, after he's become the most pleasing soul to God, is that he becomes nafsul kamila, that which is usually said perfect, but what it means is he's become perfect in his slavehood. And the way that's usually enshrined in the Quran or remarked in the Quran is being in a state of paradise. And the verse is فَادْخُلِي فِي عِبَادِي وَادْخُلِي جَنَّتِي. Enter into my slaves, my true slaves, because you become complete in your slavehood through knowing, right? We said the completion of slavehood is through knowing the Lord, so that those names have been complete, that image has been complete. The soul is no longer tainted by an otherness, it's come to see the oneness. And then the Quran says, وَادْخُلِي جَنَّتِي, enter into my paradise. This is literally the kingdom of heaven on earth. Muslims say that there is a Jannatan, there are two paradises. There is the Jannatul Na'im, it is the paradise in the next world, right? And this is the Jannatul Zakharif, this is the Jannah of the outward beauty. But there's also the Jannatul Ma'arif, the Jannah of knowing God. And in reality, paradise is simply that knowing of God. In fact, the Muslim description of paradise is beyond these great physical pleasures. A point comes when God says, do you want more? And they say, yes. What could be more than this? And then God reveals himself once more. And that nadirun, they return back to that witnessing of God. In other words, they return back to their primordiality of knowing God, because that's what human beings have been created to be. And so if they can attain that in this life, then it's as if they've entered into that kingdom of heaven. And so with this, you can understand that the great spiritual trajectory of Islam is to return people back to that witnessing of their primordiality, of who they really are. And this message is given as a message of just all the prophets. And as many of you are Christians, you can see that in many ways the Quran says that Jesus was from the Ulul Azm, the greatest of the messengers. But he was also an ayah, he was also a sign in terms of being a template. Because his life literally mirrors this kind of trajectory I've said. And so I hope this has been beneficial. This is a path that requires a lot of work. As many people say, the terrain is not the map, but this is the deep spiritual teachings of Islam. And I would really appreciate if some of you get in touch and with regard to the paper that I've sent, and I can also learn from all of you. I leave you with these blessings from Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. May the peace and blessings of God be upon you. سبحانك وبحمدك سبحان العظيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. By time, verily man is at a state of loss, except those who truly have faith in that which is not in loss, namely God. And then they give themselves, وتواصوا بالحق, they give themselves to that truth, وتواصوا بالصبر, and give themselves to patience in the adversities that they'll be facing, as a test unto how true they are to that truth. Assalamu alaikum.